These incredible golden cones are surely amongst the most spectacular and mysterious artefacts from Bronze Age Europe. Dating to between about 1600 BC and 800 BC, they look so strange as to almost be absurd. They recall the pointed hats of stereotypical witches and wizards. Only these ones, dating to over 3,000 years ago, are made from shining gold. Beautifully decorated with impressed bands, dots and circles, there are 4 known examples found in France and Germany. They would fit nicely on a person's head, and so are collectively known as golden hats. The tallest of them is an impressive 90 centimeters or 35 inches, and so when worn as a hat would make quite a remarkable impression. But who would have worn them and why? Were they made for and worn by powerful individuals like Bronze Age kings, perhaps as spectacular crowns? Well, to understand these 4 objects, we need to look at them in the context of Bronze Age Europe, their technological advancements, the gods they might have worshipped, and especially how their beliefs and practices were reflected in their material culture. So how were these special artifacts made? What did the designs on them mean? Could they be related to the widespread and long-lasting Bronze Age solar cult, religious practices relating to the movements and power of the sun, and to the transition of the soul to the afterlife? And could they even have functioned as complex, sophisticated calendars? This is the wonderful story of the mysterious golden hats of Bronze Age Europe. This video is sponsored by Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one management software that provides you with a range of applications to simplify the day-to-day management of your business, whatever its size, including invoicing, accounting, project management, website creation, and much more. The Odoo project application offers comprehensive and flexible project management that allows you to track progress, deadlines, and resources, and collaborate in real time. You can create tasks and subtasks to break down complex projects, assign people to set deadlines, schedule activities like calls or meetings, and more. Odoo centralizes collaboration within any task, allowing you to send emails, attach files, and log notes directly through the chatter, keeping everything organized in one place. You can choose the project view that best suits your workflow. The Kanban view organizes tasks by stages, like sticky notes, for a clear and intuitive overview. The Gantt view gives you a timeline to visualize task dependencies and deadlines. The list view displays all your data and lets you perform batch actions quickly and efficiently. Odoo allows you to manage your projects for free with its lifetime free first app offer, including unlimited hosting and support. So if you're interested in a comprehensive project management solution or any of Odoo's other applications for your business, please use the link in the description below to get your first application for free now. Thank you to Odoo for sponsoring the video. There are many spectacular, beautiful artifacts from Bronze Age Europe, which dates to between about 2200 BC and 800 BC. Throughout the Bronze Age, the various societies of Europe, from the Atlantic to the Aegean and from Scandinavia to Iberia, constructed stunning objects that were technologically innovative and artistically sophisticated. But there are just 4 surviving golden hats, also called golden cones, that have been discovered so far. The golden hat of Schifferstadt was found near Speyer and the River Rhine in 1835. It's dated to perhaps 1600 BC. The Aventon gold cone was found near Poitiers, France in 1844. It's dated to between about 1500 to 1200 BC. The golden cone of Ezelsdorf-Buch was found near Nuremberg in 1953, and this one is dated to about 1000 to 900 BC. It's the tallest known gold hat at 90 centimeters or 35 inches. And finally, the Berlin gold hat was probably found in Swabia or Switzerland, but it was acquired by a museum in Berlin in 1996, hence its name. It's also thought to be the latest example at around 1000 to 800 BC. When metal artifacts are found in situ by archaeologists, sometimes organic material found in and around them can be radiocarbon dated to provide dates for their burial. However, none of these hats was excavated using modern archaeological techniques. The dating for them has instead been estimated by experts based on things like the metalworking techniques and motifs used, which can be compared to a corpus of known and dated goldwork. People have been digging up precious ancient things for centuries, but it's only in recent times that archaeologists are sometimes called in to record things properly. The context of finds is extremely important in understanding how, why, and when they were buried. but in this case it's only with the hat from Schifferstadt that we have some description of how it was in the ground. It was buried upright in a pit, resting on a slab of burnt clay, along with 3 bronze axes that were buried leaning against the cone of the hat. There was no sign of a human burial, and so it almost certainly wasn't part of the burial goods for a powerful ruler. It doesn't seem to have been the crown for a Bronze Age king. Likewise, the golden cone from Ezelsdorf-Buch was likely buried upright, but no one noticed it during the removal of tree stumps when it was broken in the ground by digging tools, and then ripped up and thrown away until someone rescued the pieces. No one knows for sure where or when the Berlin gold hat was discovered, as it only came to notice when it was put up for sale in the 1990s. It had been in a private collection until then, but its good condition suggests it may also have been carefully buried upright. The private collection that owned it was in Switzerland, so it's reasoned that the hat was found in that region or in southern Germany. This would also be consistent with the style of decoration. If all the dating is accurate, it would mean the hats came from a tradition alive in Central Europe for as long as 800 years. But actually, it was likely practiced across a wider geographical area. There was an artefact known as the Cromaford Crown, discovered on the Devil's Bit Mountain in County Tipperary, Ireland in 1692. Not a cone like a wizard hat, but like a bowl with a brim, perhaps like a low-rise version of the Schifferstadt gold hat. On its discovery, this precious artefact was going to be melted down for its value in gold, but an Anglo-Irishman named Joseph Cromaford bought it and saved it. At least, saved it long enough for it to be recorded and described, before being lost to history. It's likely it was eventually melted down for its value in gold by one of Joseph's descendants after the family moved to France. It makes you wonder just how many other precious golden objects from Bronze Age Europe were discovered by farmers and treasure hunters over the centuries that were likewise melted down before ever being recorded. It's a wonder really that we have anything at all. And there are other contemporary objects that are not cones and have no brims and have often been interpreted as ornate golden bowls that could perhaps have actually been golden hats. The helmet of Liero from Atlantic Galicia dates to about 1000 to 800 BC and is decorated with the same motifs as the golden cones from Central Europe. It also has a tiny cone, like a spike, on top, or the bottom, depending on how you look at it. There are also 2 more examples from the Basque Country in the hills near Bilbao. Dating from the same era, these were interpreted as bowls, which, as they have no brims or cones, makes sense. But again, the motifs are so similar that some think perhaps they were hats, or perhaps they could have been used as both. There are other golden bowls from Iberia and elsewhere in Bronze Age Europe that are clearly not hats, so it's hard to say for sure. But we can say that although we only have 4 golden cones surviving, there may have been a more widespread tradition, perhaps taking local forms in different areas. It's worth noting that some of these golden bowls, or hats, display a star-shaped motif emanating from the centre, just as on the top of the tall golden cones, as if representing the sun's rays bursting forth from the crown. This motif is even seen on a wooden bowl or cup from the Nordic Bronze Age, where the star shape was made by embedding many tiny pins of the silvery-coloured valuable metal tin. There's no doubt the people who made these great hats were masterful gold workers. These towering cones were shaped starting from a single ingot of gold, which would have been just a few centimetres in diameter. These huge artefacts weigh between just 285 grams and 490 grams. The Berlin cone is also reinforced around the bottom with a 10mm wide strip of bronze sheet, but the gold of these hats is extremely thin. The Berlin example averages just 0.6mm in thickness. To stand up so tall and to have been usable, they would have been reinforced with a lining of some kind, perhaps stiff leather that long since rotted away. To transform the lump of gold alloy into these towering shapes took incredible skill, delicately hammering, or rather tapping, with perhaps stone, bone, antler, wood or bronze tools over a series of forms, gradually flattening out and extending the gold into these shapes. Hammering changes the quality of the metal, and it would soon grow brittle and crack if it were not repeatedly and carefully annealed by heating it to the right temperatures. The bands and symbols were impressed onto the surface by stamps, perhaps carved from wood. Imagine how careful and precise you would have to be to do this successfully. These techniques are similar to those used to create the mould cape from Wales, dating to slightly earlier in the Bronze Age, perhaps 1900 to 1600 BC. Also hammered from a single gold ingot and impressed with stamps, it was also originally attached to an organic lining, and bronze strips may have strengthened it further. The concentric bands and embossed shapes are similar to those motifs seen on the golden hats, and I would expect they represent some of the same ideas and practices. You can imagine someone important. In the case of the mould cape, it would have likely been a woman due to its small size, wearing this item during special ceremonies, the polished gold shining and the many angles flashing the reflected light of the sun as she moved and turned about. But what archaeological evidence is there for the importance of the sun in Bronze Age society? The hats are incredible, striking and unusual items. However, they are part of broader cultural traditions from across prehistoric Europe. In particular, the complex series of practices, sometimes called the Bronze Age solar cult. The ancient European fascination with the movements of the sun was expressed in the Neolithic in the form of monumental structures like Stonehenge in England and great tombs like Maes Howe in Scotland and Newgrange in Ireland. Parts of these ancient structures were precisely constructed to align with the rising or setting sun at special times of the year, like the summer or winter solstices. These were profoundly important times in the annual cycle, moments of change in the wheel of time, as the sun reached its peak in power on the longest day, grew weaker through the second half of the year, and was reborn again after the darkest day of winter. This concern with the return of the sun was surely felt more deeply in Northern Europe, where the winter days were so short, and long winters could freeze the very earth for weeks on end. Creating permanent monuments required a human, earthly power, harnessing communal efforts to shift stones and earth, as well as the power of knowledge and the ability to know the future. Exactly setting the stones at Maes Howe in Orkney so that the light of the midwinter setting sun shone into the tomb marked the death of the year and its impending rebirth. The stones and the people who built them made a connection between the death and rebirth of the sun and the death and rebirth of the ancestors, of human souls as individuals, and so celebrated and reinforced the longevity of the community. Marking these moments created a connection between the realms of the earth and the sky, a temporary bridge between the sun and the stones, a kind of harnessing of the life-giving power of the sun. As the population of Europe changed through large-scale migrations at the end of the Neolithic and the development of the Belbeker culture, the use of large monuments continued at sites like Stonehenge and Pomelta in Germany, and new monuments that related to the movements of the sun continued to be created in the landscape. But along with new people, cultural practices, social structures and metalworking technologies came new ways to express these relationships with the sun. The early Belbeker period in Western Europe, from about 2500 BC onwards, brought with it goldworking, and some of the earliest gold artefacts here are small sun discs found along the Atlantic coasts from Britain and Ireland through France to Iberia. These miniature suns often feature decoration in the forms of circles around a central cross. This ancient solar symbol would continue to be seen throughout the Bronze Age. The circle being the sun, and the cross could reflect the cardinal directions, the shine of the sun's rays, like in a winter sundog at dawn, and divide the eternal recurring year of the circle into 4 seasons. In these early sun discs, the patterns also feature repeating dots or lines, perhaps conveying the sun's rays or the days within a year. Probably sewn onto clothing or burial shrouds, these were perhaps related to concepts of rebirth, through the rising and setting sun, and the dying and reborn year, and the dying and reborn soul. We'll talk more about this later. Gold was the perfect material for a society entranced by the sun. The polished surface of the material seemed to somehow capture and reflect back a fraction of its power. Found in gold-rich locations throughout Europe, likely in the form of nuggets and flakes washed from highland deposits by rivers and streams, you wonder if they also conceived of it as in some way solidified sunlight sent down from the heavens to the earth. This substance was also transformed by heat and light, and the art of the metalworker into increasingly complex and beautiful forms throughout the Bronze Age. Dating to around 2200 to 1900 BC, over 100 beautiful gold lanulae have been found, mostly in Ireland and also southern Britain and Brittany. These very thin golden ornaments were worn around the neck, and the flat, shining surfaces would have flashed the reflected power of the sun from the chest of the wearer. Maybe 1,000 years later, goldwork and Bronze Age society had developed so far that much heavier golden collars were made, known as gorgets. Where the older, flat lanulae were decorated with inscribed triangular patterns, these later ones were more three-dimensional, with impressed lines and punched forms, and with even finer concentric circles. Perhaps objects like this were worn by elites as displays of their wealth and power, or perhaps they were related to the solar cult. Decorations on the ancient lanulae are often similar to those inscribed on bell-beaker pots, which were also related to rites of transformation, death, and rebirth. As well as wearable golden artefacts, Bronze Age European master craftsmen constructed ritual objects from metal that were also related to the solar cult. The most famous example is the Trundholm Sun Chariot. Dating to 1400 to 1300 BC, it is a bronze horse on 4 wheels, pulling a great bronze disc mounted on a 2-wheel carriage. One side of the disc was covered in ornate gold. This magnificent artefact was discovered in a bog on the Danish island of Zealand in 1902. The farmer who ploughed up the pieces assumed it was an old toy and gave it to his daughter to play with. It was eventually recognised as an ancient ceremonial object depicting the Sun Chariot being pulled across the sky by a cosmic horse. We can see that it had a function as a ritual object, as the golden side shows a sun being pulled from left to right, or from east to west, just as the sun moves daily through the sky. The opposite side has no gold, and so represents the night sky or perhaps the moon. We can imagine then a ritual where the movements in the heavens were reenacted here on the earth, facilitated by priests and accompanied by appeals to the heavens, recitation of special words, perhaps chanting song, and the sound of the great bronze lures dating to this era. Depictions of rituals are seen in the rock art of Bronze Age southern Scandinavia, where men hold aloft great curving axes and spears, along with solar symbols and thousands of carvings of boats. The journey of the sun across the sky was associated archaeologically not only with a horse pulling it in a chariot, but in other kinds of vehicles, like boats and wagons, and in association with other kinds of animals, like the sun deer seen as far away as Iberia, and especially swans. In Central Europe, the so-called bird-sun-boat motif is seen repeatedly in various forms. Water birds, as creatures of the air, the land, and the water, were able to move between the realms of heaven and earth, and between this world and the afterworld, which was often accessed through water. We even see models of solar boats with wheels, powered by birds and even commanded by human-bird hybrids, perhaps representing gods, like the Dawn Goddess, or spirits serving as guides. This was the ultimate Bronze Age spiritual amphibious vehicle. The archaeological evidence points to a belief in the daily journey of the sun across the sky by chariot, before it lands and descends into the earth or underwater, where it was damped or dimmed. The sun then journeys through the underworld in darkness, perhaps carried by a night ship from west to east, before rising again to be drawn through the heavens once more. In a changeable world, the eternally repeating daily and annual solar cycles were life's only certainty. The sun's journey across the heavens and into the underworld was perhaps linked to the transition of the human soul from this world into the next. Just as the sun was carried by horses, birds and boats, so the soul was escorted across the realms to the afterlife, to one day be reborn like the sun, carried in the vessel of the womb, before emerging back into the world. Solar motifs relating to the heavens, featuring birds, horses or boats, are seen in goldwork on artefacts like golden bowls with horsehead handles from Denmark, in the many bronze sun discs worn by women of the Nordic Bronze Age across their womb in life and in burial, again demonstrating the sun's association with death and rebirth, and in the famous Nebra sky disc from Central Europe dating to 1600 BC with its golden sun and golden solar boat. This ritual item was buried along with 2 swords with golden inlays on the handles and 2 axes, we must remember this recurring motif of twinned weapons along with the sun. The archaeological evidence shows us these kinds of motifs and associations, but what can ancient mythology and folk stories tell us about the Bronze Age solar cult? When trying to understand the beliefs of pre-literate Bronze Age Europe, attempts have been made to reconstruct them, at least to some extent, by looking for clues in later records of mythology from the various descendant Indo-European societies. There were various deities linked to the sun, and there are common motifs associated with them. For example, famously the Greek god Apollo, associated with the sun, travelled every winter to Hyperborea on a chariot drawn by swans. Greek mythology and deities themselves were often influenced by non-Indo-European societies of the Eastern Mediterranean, but the underlying importance of the ancient sun god tradition shines through. Other familiar Greek sun deities, like the female Eos and the male Helios, her brother, convey something of the complexities of Indo-European sun worship. Eos was a manifestation of the goddess of the dawn, who would rise each day and hand the sun off to her brother, who would carry it across the sky in his chariot. In Indo-European traditions, different aspects of the sun would have specific deities representing them. Comparative mythology and linguistics have reconstructed the Proto-Indo-European dawn goddess as Hausos. She was the daughter of the Sky Father, the daylight sky, and she was associated with the golden yellow and red colours of the dawn, the rising sun. And her name, Hausos, comes from a Proto-Indo-European root word meaning to shine or glow. This is the same root that underlies the Proto-Indo-European word for gold. Her historically recorded descendant deities tended to be associated with a vehicle like a carriage pulled by oxen or horses, or by birds like swallows or swans, or a silver or golden boat. In Baltic and Slavic mythology, the dawn goddess travels in her boat beneath the earth to the underworld, the place where the dead reside for the dark of the night, before emerging once again in her eternal rebirth. A common motif is her daily reluctance to emerge into the world for various mythological reasons. Often she does not wish to leave her lover's bed and must be coaxed or forced from it. In many mythologies, she's associated with horses, and as with her Greek incarnation Eos, she has a sibling, or more often two siblings, the horse twins, also known as the divine twins. They were the youthful brothers who pulled the sun chariot across the sky, riding or driving two horses, or were the horses themselves. They were young men and warriors, travellers and sailors, usually found rescuing the goddess and others from the water. Mallory and Adams in the Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture say the following, quote, "It was the widely attested belief that the horses of the sun traversed the sky during the day in a pursuit of their consort the morning star. The divine twins, the sun god and his daughters, the morning and evening stars, would rest at the end of the day on the islands in the Western Sea. At night, they would return to the east in a golden boat." End quote. Those islands in the west were also the islands of the dead, to where the souls of the deceased travel and reside. You can see then the mythology and the archaeology aligning to tell us something about the belief systems of the people in this era. Panels of Nordic Bronze Age rock art from southern Scandinavia show scenes portraying the journey of a day boat through the sky and a night boat travelling back through the underworld. But how does all this relate to the form and functions of the golden hats? How might they have been used in ritual activities related to these beliefs around the sun and the afterlife? Rituals can be carried out for many reasons, like honouring specific gods and observing natural cycles like the seasons or the changing states of the sun or moon. Just like today, there were rites of passage between different states of being for birth, marriage and death, and the transitions between youth and adulthood. These activities would be accompanied by musical instruments, singing and chanting, and by dancing. Rites could be accompanied by offerings or sacrifices, giving up a portion of or the whole of something precious to the gods, whether beer or milk, parts of an animal, or even people. Rites could be common and small scale, happening daily and carried out alone or in a small family group, or they could be enormous events, attended by hundreds or thousands of people, occurring only once a year, or once a generation, or only on the death of a truly great person, or some magnificent achievement. The forms of rituals could recreate the stories of mythology on Earth, acted out by priests or participants, or witnessed by an audience. From what we know of the solar cult, it seems likely rituals involving the golden hats were carried out to honour the dawn goddess, and especially in relation to death and rebirth. Perhaps also in marking the seasons, and perhaps to honour the departure or safe arrival of travellers, who in most cases would have been warriors. Ritual activities are featured in artwork at a special burial mound known as the King's Grave in southern Sweden. This was an enormous stone structure dating to the 15th century BC, containing burials surrounded by stone slabs with many fascinating motifs. One of these slabs appeared to display 2 spears and 2 axes, with a Bronze Age boat beneath, and what is surely a tall, conical golden hat with a wide brim in the centre. The axes are depicted with curving handles, as if they are leaning towards the hat in between them. Here we can see the golden hats clearly associated with, central to, in fact, other symbols associated with ritual activities in Bronze Age Europe to do with the sun, journeying, and specific ritual weapons in pairs. Academics have pointed out the similarities between this image from Bronze Age Sweden to the ritual deposition of the hat from Schifferstadt, which, if you recall, was found buried upright, with 3 axes leaning against it. It seems likely then that the hat was buried in a manner reflecting its ritual use. Before we talk more about the rituals, we must first address whether these hats were more than beautiful objects to be worn and displayed to reflect and recall the light of the sun. There are some people who believe at least 1 or 2 of the hats in fact functioned as Lunisolar calendars. Research on the Berlin hat especially has concluded that the different bands and symbols encode mathematical information about the regular movements of the moon and the sun through the year. If true, this would be an extraordinary feat of mathematical and astronomical complexity for a pre-literate society 3,000 years ago. There are different numbers of rings around the raised bosses in different bands. And in one band there are crescent symbols and eye-shaped symbols that could be representations of the moon in different phases. It seems possible these artistic choices could be interpreted as representing different phases of the solar and lunar cycles. But I am highly sceptical that it functioned as a lunisolar calendar. The calculations required to decode it seem dubiously complex, while at the same time any imprecision is waved away as Bronze Age incompetence. And these calculations don't apply to the other examples. It seems likely then that their actual function was for use in ritual activities related to the sun. The details of how these rituals took place are hard to determine from archaeology, because brief acts performed by people don't tend to leave much evidence behind to be found. As well as comparative mythology and the archaeological record of gold and other objects, we also have limited figurative artwork from Northern Europe depicting, amongst other things, ritual activities. The meanings of the various images shown on the slabs in the King's Grave in Sweden are hotly debated. Some see them as a narrative of heroic achievements in the life of the man interred in the primary burial, others that they portray coming-of-age rites, or perhaps the complex burial rites themselves. So it's not clear, but we do see motifs of vehicles like chariots and boats, animals like horses, and processions of human-bird hybrids, or perhaps hooded people in robes, and the sun wheel or solar cross. There are also people raising axes and bronze lures into the air, and there's also some sort of potentially rotating device that may represent the sun and the moon. We're also blessed with the tens of thousands of images on the open-air rock art of southern Scandinavia, showing figures engaged in various activities, including raising ritual axes to the sky. And we know these kinds of axes specifically were made for ritual and not war, because they're actually quite thin bronze, cunningly cast around a clay core. We know for sure that complex metal objects could be made specifically for ritual use. Bronze Age rock art is an incredibly complex subject, with different traditions practiced in different regions of Scandinavia for over 1,000 years, but we can see activities involving boats, animals, axes and spears, bronze lures, and motifs representing the sun. The various iterations of the solar cult found throughout Bronze Age Europe over centuries or millennia would also have had different kinds of ritual practices in different places. But from the evidence we do have, we can assume that the activities took place at special ritual sites. There's not much evidence for specific ritual buildings like temples in this era, although there are some. For example, timber structures beside burial mounds with evidence of occasional small fires and animal bones where rituals might have been carried out and sacrificial offerings made when communing with the ancestors. Nevertheless, one would expect that solar rituals would take place in the open air, perhaps at stone or timber circles or enclosures, especially those with alignments relating to solar events. Rituals generally take place in delineated spaces, physically separated from the everyday world, even if these spaces are only temporarily marked out. It could be that some rituals took place in the landscape. I'd imagine these would be hilltops, open hillsides facing south or towards the rising sun, or on the sea shore as the sun rises. And the time of year and time of day was surely of vital importance. Perhaps they took place or started or ended at sunrise or sunset, or at midday. Perhaps grand events occurred at the solstices or equinoxes, or perhaps they could happen throughout the year in association with other important events like the birth of an important child or the death of a great chieftain. Who might have carried out these rituals? Well, due to their immense value, it's believed the golden hats would have been worn by either priests or chieftains. In many societies, you can have both a priestly class of ritual specialists, but also see leaders like chiefs leading rituals themselves as representatives of the tribe to the gods, and or as representing the gods to the tribe. There is a theory that the hats might not have been worn at all. They might have been considered the headwear of a god, and held aloft or placed on a platform, representing the presence of a god for the ritual. In the rock art of Bronze Age Europe, there's a common motif of a pair of feet carved into the rocks. Some people think these might indicate the presence of a god standing amongst the ritual activity. Others have suggested they were markers where actual priests or chiefs stood on the flat rock surfaces while rites took place. In fact, it could be both at the same time. Many rites, speaking generally here, were reconstructions on Earth of ancient mythological events practiced by the gods and heroic ancestors. Perhaps when standing in specific places during certain rites, the priests or chiefs were transformed and temporarily became the gods or ancestors themselves. Likewise, the wearing of the golden hats could have transformed the wearers into the gods as their representatives for the duration of the rites. It's widely believed the golden hats were likely not constructed for specific individuals or owned by them as property as such. Certainly, we have not found any in the many thousands of burials known from the era. People were often buried with valuable metal items, like jewellery for women and weapons for men, personal objects that they wore and used in life, and would carry with them into the afterlife. As far as we know, however, none were buried with golden hats. It seems they weren't considered personal property, or at least were not the proper kind of artefact for burial with people. And there's an intriguing group of artefacts from Scandinavia, Austria and Italy during the Bronze Age that links tall hats, solar symbols and priests. Bronze Age Sardinia is also known as the Nuragic civilization. The degree of Indo-European linguistic and religious influence on the island is debated, and they certainly had their own unique ritual practices and unique temple sites. They also made many small cast bronze figurines with wonderful details intended to be votive offerings. These included animals and warriors, and also many figures portraying priests who wore tall, pointed hats. This suggests pointy hats were a symbol of the priestly class, or were worn by people who conducted rituals. They probably aren't supposed to be made from gold though, they're probably leather or felt or something. But what priests did in non-Indo-European Sardinia would have little relevance for the rest of Indo-European Europe, or so I once thought. However, there was one group of bronze votive objects from Sardinia that were found deposited in Italy across the Tyrrhenian Sea. Along with a priest with a pointed hat, there was this strange miniature stool. This 5-wheeled stool seems to represent in miniature a type of artefact known from 2 full-size examples, one from Austria, right on the border with Hungary, and one from southern Sweden. These were about 1,000 kilometres away from one another, but the 2 locations are linked by the so-called Amber Road, the trade routes between the Baltic and the Mediterranean, along which precious amber travelled throughout the era. These 2 bronze objects are so similar they must have been made in the same workshop, or at least in the same region, likely Austria. There are 10 sun wheels around the sides, and the circular sheet of bronze on top is decorated with concentric bands of sun rays. Exactly what they are is debated. Some suggest they were supposed to be hit like a drum or a gong. It's more likely they were the top of a wooden stool. Some think it might have been sat on by a priest during solar rites. The diameter of the bronze disc is 43 centimeters or 17 inches. The miniature version has a small hole in the top, perhaps for another figure to be fixed on it. I wonder if a tall hatted priest might even have stood on top of it, with the stool and hat elevating them even more above the audience and closer to the sun. There are even some figures in the Bronze Age rock art of southern Sweden that seem to be wearing tall hats, along with a sun wheel and a large ritual axe. So here we have evidence for priests, tall hats and solar symbols all together. The dating of the golden hats is interesting. If they do stretch from 1600 BC to 1000 BC or even later, then they first emerge at the start of the Central European tumulus culture and continue to be made in the Urnfield culture, which emerges around 1200 BC. This is interesting because the most obvious difference between these two phases of the European Bronze Age is the mortuary ritual. In the tumulus culture, powerful people were buried lying in graves beneath burial mounds known as barrows or tumuli, hence the name. This was an Indo-European tradition dating back thousands of years to its origins in Eastern Europe. The later Urnfield culture, on the other hand, usually cremated the dead and placed the ashes and burned bones in large pottery vessels or urns and buried many of them together in flat cemeteries or burial fields, hence the name Urnfield culture. This change in mortuary practice is thought to represent a widespread change in the corresponding belief systems too, although exactly what is hard to say. Perhaps they started to think that sending the soul to the afterlife was best done through transforming the body into smoke and ashes. This new religion, if you could call it that, was incredibly popular and was taken up by multiple ethnic groups throughout Europe. So it's perhaps surprising that the golden hats, and presumably their associated rites, continued to be made and used across the two eras. Maybe this rite was simply that important and enduring, at least in certain areas. Perhaps there were many gold hats made, maybe even dozens or hundreds, or maybe there was only ever a few precious ones. Either way, they were surely passed on through generations, perhaps controlled by the priestly class until it came time for them to be buried in their final ritual. We see evidence for various kinds of ritual activity in the bronze hoards and ritual deposits found from this era. Bronze hoards are groups of metal objects, like swords, axes and jewellery for example, found buried together in the earth. The way the objects were treated before and during the depositions often shows these were careful, deliberate acts. Swords, for example, were often deliberately bent and bound together before being sunk into a river or bog. Axe heads might have been smashed into pieces after being heated to a specific temperature range before being buried. These kinds of depositions were likely the result of communal ritual activities full of meaningful actions for the participants. Broken and bound swords buried at the conclusion of a peace treaty between warring tribes, or weapons won in battle being given to the gods in thanks for victory. A unique object was buried in Central Europe in around 1600 BC at the end of the Unetice culture and the rise of the tumulus culture. This remarkable bronze disc with golden symbols has been called the world's first astronomical depiction of the sky, as it features the Pleiades constellation, the sun and moon, and a solar boat. It went through various changes during its life as a ritual object, eventually being mounted to something. Perhaps it was a piece of wood and was held aloft as a banner of some kind, a symbol of ancient power and wisdom, as well as ethnic or class identity. It was ritually deposited on a hilltop, along with 2 swords, 2 axes, and a chisel and bracelets. The form of the deposition may in some way reflect the ritual usage in life. Interestingly, the twin swords and twin axes reflect the twinned weapons seen in the king's grave and the axes buried with the Schifferstadt cone. It seems likely that at least in some instances, the solar rites using the golden hats included 2 or more weapons being held up beside or over them, held aloft by priests or young warriors over the head of the hat-wearing priest, the weapons demonstrating the presence of the divine twins, protecting the dawn goddess and projecting their power as warriors and saviours over her, and over the ritual participants. We must imagine too the fires, the speaking or singing of the sacred words, the drums and the sounding of the lyres, calling forth the reluctant dawn goddess into the world. Although details of the fine circumstances are largely unknown, all 4 surviving golden hats were deposited in the earth in the Bronze Age. That's why we have them today. They were all buried in the earth at the end of their active lives, so to speak. The people who used them decided for some reason that the time had come to stop using them and to put them into the ground. They did so, perhaps, in similar ways to how they had been used in life. Perhaps they did so rather than continue to use them because some change had occurred in their society. Maybe the lineage of priests or chiefs using them had ended. Maybe the ritual had failed in some way, and seasons of poor weather or a change in climate had led to crop failures. Maybe their belief systems changed, and new rites and objects were required. Or perhaps they were grand gifts to the gods, seeking some special favour or good fortune. These depositions were surely sacred rituals themselves, and we can imagine again scenes of priests and attendees in ritual clothing with bronze horns and singing as they were put reverently into the earth. It could have been done at sunrise in the presence of the dawn goddess, or perhaps it was done in darkness, lit only by fires, when she herself was residing in the underworld. It would make sense if it was also done in the dark of the longest night of the winter solstice. Could they have hoped their ritual depositions of the golden hats would spur the goddess into her eventual rebirth? If so, it's perhaps fitting then that they were eventually found and brought back into the light. Thank you very much indeed to my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. Now, please watch this video about Nordic Bronze Age rock art and what it can tell us about ritual, masculinity and warfare in ancient Europe. Thank you for watching.